Is your team not performing well? Is morale low and turnover high? Are you falling further behind the competition? I'm here to help. I'm Shani Magoski, and this is the Leadershifter Show, where business strategy and culture finally meet. Explore shifts of all kinds required to build cultures of trust, engagement, and execution excellence. I promise I am not your typical boring leadership consultant, and I will help you and your team get your shift together. All right. Welcome, Leadershifters, to another episode of the Leadershifter Show with yours truly, Shani. It is a treat today to welcome our guest, Luke Iorio, onto the show today. Say a quick hello, and then I'm going to regale you with accolades.
Shani, thank you so much for having me here.
It's my pleasure. So, folks, Luke is the former CEO of iPEC, which is the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching. It is one of the top coaching certification programs in the world. And part of what we'll talk about today are some of his experiences leading a coaching organization and what the culture was like there. And more recently, Luke has gone out on his own. He has a podcast as well. It's called On This Walk, where he literally walks with his guests through their stories, and we'll hear a little bit about the tone and the content that you'll be able to partake in as you dial into his podcast. Another big topic we're going to talk about today, and we have never talked about this on the Leadershifter Show before, so strap in: masculine vulnerability. And that doesn't mean this episode is just for men. Men have women in their lives, whether they're sisters, mothers, daughters, spouses, etc. So with that, Luke, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here, Shani. Been looking forward to it and look forward to seeing where we go with this.
Terrific. So, folks, Luke joins us from Northern New Jersey. We have that New York City thing in common. And of course, we have the coaching thing in common. Although Luke obtained much higher status in the coaching industry than I have, despite my high opinion of my coaching abilities. So talk to us about your journey with iPEC. How did you link up with them and become CEO, and what was your experience?
It's funny because I found coaching in a way that I actually heard a lot of back when I originally discovered coaching. So this would have been around 2004 when I first discovered it. And I found it completely by accident. I didn't know anything about it, because you're talking now 19 years ago. Actually, it was really close to 20 years ago. And coaching was not very well known at that point, right? So we were one of the early schools in, along with CTI and some of the others. The ICF, the International Coach Federation, the governing body of the industry, had really only been around maybe about 10, 11 years at that point. It was a much, much, much smaller industry than it is today. Now it's reports of it over being $2.5 billion or so at this point of an industry. Mm-hmm. And so at the time, I knew nothing about it. I got contacted actually by the former business partner of Bruce Schneider, who's the founder of iPEC. And when I got their email, they were looking for what seemed like a lot of free consulting advice. I was doing marketing and management consulting at the time. And I saw the 40 questions that they were interested in. And to be honest, it was an email that on most days I delete. And I caught coaching at the end of the URL. And I grew up playing sports. So I went onto their website expecting to see something completely different. And I read all about the field of coaching. And I recognized very quickly I was doing work as a consultant, but specific to small business. So I was working with entrepreneurs, businesses under about 30 million or so in revenue. And what I was seeing in coaching was helping me identify something that I was seeing in the business owners I was working with. And so a lot of these leaders, the businesses that were very, very successful versus those that were not, even if they were in the same industry, similar resources, similar talent among their teams, the group that was more successful had a leader that was more self-engaged, more self-empowered, more self-aware.
Yep.
And they just infinitely were going to thrive and succeed and move forward. Whereas the other group, despite similar resources, similar talent, et cetera, tended to flounder. They tended to go around in circles, and they could never really get to that next level. And in most instances, it was a leader who was looking for things to be fixed for him or her, as opposed to just diving into things, admitting when things weren't going wrong, admitting when they had done something that didn't work out. And it was just a completely different atmosphere that was created around the leader. Now, in a small business, it's really easy to get a sense of the culture of the whole business, because you're talking anywhere from, maybe half a dozen to 30, 40, 50 employees for most of the businesses I was with. So you could see the culture, like in real time. You could see what was going on, and you can see the relationship to the leader in that circumstance, in that environment. So anyway, I got fascinated by the field. I got fascinated by what I thought it would help me be able to do with my clients. And I started doing that work. And it was shortly after I completed my coach training that Bruce Schneider made me the proverbial offer, that I couldn't refuse. And I closed down the consulting practice, and I actually joined iPEC full time, and was with him for 17 years.
Wow.
And it was a wild ride. I mean, we saw, as I said, this huge growth of the coaching industry. We saw our own organization grow by something like 700% over the course of that time. Opened up locations all around the world, and graduates from 44 different countries.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to what coaching ended up providing, which is it really helped people get centered back in on how is it that we begin to discover our own answers? How is it that we begin to discover the innate wisdom that exists inside of every single one of us? And how do we start to remove the blocks, the stories, the conditioning, the blocks within our consciousness that prevent us from seeing that, feeling that, and accessing that on a regular basis? And more people have been coming back to that because they've recognized, I can't really follow somebody else's advice. I can't follow somebody else's path. And they've discovered this as their way to really begin to excel.
Right. As you're speaking, what comes up for me is something I try and drill into the heads of leaders when I work with corporate teams, which is coaching is not remedial. Coaching is not for your poor performers. And back to your sports analogy, that would be like the coach of the almost championship Miami Heat,
Right.
only coaching the bench warmers, right?
Right. But if you look at any number of different athletes, you look at, let's use actually the program for the Seattle Seahawks and run by their coach, Pete Carroll. He has been dedicated to things like mindfulness and working on the whole person for their athletes to be able to excel in what they do. And at the time, it led to a lot of high performance for a number of years. They, kind of not as great as they were a couple of years ago, but nonetheless.
Right.
But he made this commitment. Right. And he made this commitment to the way in which he wanted his athletes to be able to thrive, to their mental health, their emotional health, their spiritual health, not just their physical fitness. And by making that commitment, created a great deal of success. I point to that because it's more well known, but most organizations now have adopted that. Yes. If you look at who is used and why did coaching become such a thing, it became a thing because it started mostly in the executive boardrooms. And it was individuals like, at the time, the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, after he'd taken over for Larry and Sergey, he talked a lot about the importance of coaching on his own life, his own style, his own leadership. And Google, among many others, especially out of Silicon Valley, have made huge investments in coaching their leaders because they saw the advantage there. The irony, though, that you bring up is that when you go back and you look at the kind of the consumer surveys, the market surveys the ICF has done through the years, most people associate coaching with either the extreme high performer or extreme remedial situations. And the funny thing is that to me, where coaching makes the greatest difference is the 60% in the middle of the bell curve, because the high performers are going to find ways to be high performers. It's not to say they can't excel further. Of course they can.
Right.
For those that do need some form of remedial, and I hate even using that word remedial, because more often than not, they're just not in the right situation. They're not aligned to where they're supposed to be more often than not. But for an organization and for leadership, the kind of focus we're talking about, being able to bring this type of focus into that middle 60%, that can engage at a higher level or engage at a lower level, depending on the way in which you respond to them and the culture you create as a leader within your team, your division, your corporation, is where it can actually make the biggest difference. But we tend to associate any type of service like this with the polar opposites, but it doesn't have to be the case.
One thing that I do like, I love the show Ted Lasso. In addition to just being highly entertained by it and in love with all the characters, I love what it's doing for the perception of coaching in the sense that a great coach does not have to be an expert in the field, doesn't even have to know a damn thing about soccer in the Ted Lasso to coach a highly successful team. And I personally am loving that shift.
It's interesting because I'm invested in and a partner with another organization right now that focuses on the behavioral space. It's both business to consumer as well as a business to business type service. And what they're showing is that when organizations for all these however many centuries at this point have largely focused in on what are their business strategies, meaning how as I as the coach know the most about football or soccer. And they're focused on the business tactics, the business acumen, the strategy, everything that's involved in that. And what has become a glaring issue for all corporations is that they don't have a people strategy. They don't have this understanding of how are we going to create the best environment that we can, including the way of relating to and helping and supporting our teams get the best out of themselves, and to do so not from a place of typical strategy and tactics, but by actually really truly understanding human psychology and wanting the best for our employees. Mm-hmm. And this is an extraordinary organization that's beginning to help corporations to see that and to do it in a manner that meets the employees where they are, that is based on an employee-driven agenda for how they ultimately want to be able to perform. Mm-hmm. And then how do you create that alignment with their talent, with their genius, with everything they can bring to the table, and create alignment between that and the business strategy, as opposed to how it's always been, which is strategy first, planning second, and then somewhere down the line, get in line with that because this is what we need to get done.
Yeah, 100%. So speaking of people strategy, I sort of a segue to what is now one of your big niches, which is working with men around masculine vulnerability. I know you do some men's circles. There's one midstream right now. And it's such an important topic. Vulnerability has been in the zeitgeist for a while now, since Brene Brown popularized the notion, put some left brain science and research behind vulnerability. But I think we still have a long way to go. And not to say that women don't have work to do on vulnerability. Mm-hmm. So let's yes and it. And there's not as many people talking about how men can get there and still feel like men.
Yeah, we've got on the men masculine side of things, there are so many different stories and societal conditioning that has also been there. And again, this is a yes and conversation. This is just, I'm making this specific to men and masculine situations. But vulnerability has been one of those words and concepts that very much flies directly in the face of what men have largely been taught and conditioned to be through centuries, right? And so we can't do that because we've got to be tough. We've got to push down our emotions. We've got to find a way to either be calmer than anything else going on, or we've actually got to be even bigger and more aggressive than what's going on, depending on what the situation is demanding, as it were, of men. And unfortunately, when you do that and you condition that decades after decades, centuries after centuries of effectively training warriors in a sense, then you're gonna have things get to a place where they're out of balance. And it's not to say for men, for those that are tuning in, this is not to say that we don't need to find ways to be able to tap into and stay within that strength that we can be able to provide within who it is that we are. But it's to say, what's the balance? Where do we become more integrated as human beings, not just as integrated as men, so that we've got that ability to both be strong, but also recognized vulnerability. And so in vulnerability, very often what it begins with is self-awareness, because there's a lot of things that are taking place inside of our psyches. It's true for any human being,
Sure.
where we don't recognize the way in which our past conditioning, whether that be lessons that were learned or hurts that we went through in our life that we learned to just push our way through, we don't recognize how much that conditioning is effectively controlling the way that we show up and behave in today's environment. Combine that with societal conditioning and it gets amplified. And so most men will tell you that somewhere on their top values is some expression of the feeling of freedom, to have that sense of personal freedom. What we don't realize is the very things that tend to imprison us are the conditioning, are the patterns that have been ingrained in us that we haven't been vulnerable enough to look at, that are actually imprisoning us, that are actually keeping us trapped. And so we, when I say vulnerability, to me, vulnerability is one of the greatest strengths that any human being can have.
Sure.
For men, it's a different type of courage for men to be able to face or a fly in the face of what has been the conditioning and social conditioning for very, very long, and to recognize that vulnerability is by no means a weakness. It is actually something that gives you extraordinary strength, and it reintroduces you to this place of empowerment, of decision-making in your life, where you begin to recognize that, hey, I used to make these decisions because I was trying to not feel that pain, or I was trying to look a certain way, or I was trying to keep up this image, and instead being able to lay down those conditions and say, actually, from this different place, from my intuition, from my heart, as a man, what is actually the path that is greatest alignment for me, that's most congruent to the leader I want to be, to the father I want to be, to the partner I want to be. And so to me, that it's moving us in that direction, and facing vulnerability is one of the kind of the greatest things that we need to do as men, so that we can actually start to get to know ourselves in a deeper way again.
Yes. I'm going to take a TV timeout to reinforce a couple of things that you just said, and I may not get them verbatim, but hopefully I get the gist of it and jump in if I'm misconstruing.
Sure.
So men, if you've got a strong value around freedom, which many of you do, the conditioning from your childhood and from society is imprisoning you. And so if you want freedom, you've got to get out of the shackles. Maybe I'm taking the analogy too far, of what's holding you back. And so don't confuse vulnerability with weakness. Vulnerability is actually one of the most powerful forms of strength, and it will serve you well in every aspect of your life. Fair summary?
Absolutely, Shani. It is. And, there's so much that, it takes a lot of vulnerability for, a man to get aware of the way in which maybe they've covered up some of those pains and hurts.
Yeah.
It takes vulnerability for a man to look at what are some of the impulses that I want to have better control over in my life, that I don't want to let an impulse, but instead my higher self be able to make the choice that's in front of me. What is it for me in vulnerability that allows me to actually form deeper, real connections with other men or with just other human beings, so that I feel that sense of connection, I feel that sense of support within my life. There's all sorts of statistics that are out there right now that talk about, by a magnitude of how much lonelier, how much more susceptible to suicide and all sorts of other issues for men, that men are more so than women. And a lot of that has to do with keeping everything bottled up, keeping it repressed, keeping it suppressed, not feeling like we have an outlet to be able to lay down that armor and actually have a conversation about genuinely, authentically, and vulnerably what's going on within ourselves. And yet, whenever I see that in a men's circle, with some of the men's work that I've done, some of the men's work that I've been a part of and have had the benefit of being in the room and being facilitated through,
Sure.
to see the beautiful vulnerability that comes there, and the strength when you realize that you've got other men surrounding you saying, it's okay, you're not alone. We've been through similar things along this line, and we're not going to let you fall. We're going to stand with you no matter what it is you've got to go through to face whatever it is that you need to face. And when men begin to see that, to me, it's reflective not only of our men's journey, but it's reflective of society as well, is that, and I do think this also is highly related though to men. We've got a society that has glamorized the lone cowboy, the Marlboro man, for so long, right?
James Dean,
right, James, absolutely. We've got James Dean and John Wayne, right? And so we've got this stereotyped image, but it's all about being the loner. It's about being individualized. And if you go back more centuries, you recognize that one of the things that we miss the most is gathering together as men and even as a village around the fire. How is it that we can be as community? Because we recognized we were stronger together. We recognized the support that we could gain from each other. We also recognized that we could voice what we needed to voice to receive the help that we needed to receive, because we didn't have to be all things to all people at all times.
Right.
And so we need that remembrance of, we need vulnerability. We also need containers, spaces that we can gather that allows us to feel safe, accepted, not judged. And we feel like we can trust laying down that armor to have the real conversations.
Yeah.
And I have found that, that they can do that certainly with a coach, but there's a reason why I do it in circle and group-based work, is because I think there's something more powerful right now to remind men we can come back together again around the fire, around the circle, and gather together.
Absolutely. So let me give you a scenario. You encounter a highly armored man, and he is interested in cracking through that armor. And this all sounds great to him theoretically.
Yeah.
And maybe he's even joined a men's circle, but he doesn't know, other than the process of connecting with the men, which is going to take some time to break through that armor. What are like one or two like tactics that someone listening who relates to that highly armored guy, what's something they can do right now to get more comfortable with vulnerability?
Okay. So, well, to step in the direction, let me say it that way, to step in the direction of vulnerability. Okay. And I would look at it as two things. I'd look at somatics and I'd look at leverage. So from a somatic standpoint, I knew this former client that lived the majority of their life from the neck up. And they recognized that they had shut down most of what they even physically were going through, because if they allowed themselves to feel physically, they'd begin to feel emotionally. And they were a little bit worried the more that they got into their body, what might come up. And that was very, very terrifying. And I know this because the client was me. This is what I went through. Okay. And I've had many, many clients who have also gone through the same. So for me, one of the first and very important parts of my journey, and meditation was tied to this, but very specifically, even just basic mindfulness practice. Like, you don't need to go sit on a cushion 20 minutes twice a day. Like, I'm not going to ask you to jump there, but to even take 10 deep conscious breaths, meaning staying with your full inhale and with your full exhale. And as you're taking those 10 breaths, just bring your awareness from your body, from the top of your mind, right, the top of your head, and begin to scan different parts of your body. Scan down to your neck. Recognize how tense, how tight that it might be. Recognize where your shoulders are. Are they slumped forward, or are they open and back so that your chest is open and you can breathe? Do you feel the relaxation that's there in your core, or does it feel constricted, or does it feel open? Can you feel the tightness that exists inside of your hips or in the back of your legs, all the way down into your ankles and even into your wrists? And when you start to do those types of body scans, very, very simple form of meditation, but it doesn't require chanting Om for 20 minutes.
Sure.
It's very different, and it starts connecting to your body again. And when you start to feel safer in your body, you'll start to feel safer with the emotions that are actually underneath the physical experience.
Love that.
But for a lot of men, when I say feeling safe in our bodies, I don't mean you could be as muscle bound and spend as many hours in the gym as you want to be. But that's very different than feeling safe in your body, because what I'm talking about is your nervous system.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, why do I say that somatics is that if you use somatics, there's many, many other practices. I just give you a really, really simple glimpse of something. what you're doing is you're beginning to regulate your nervous system so that you can begin to go into that rest and recovery mode, also known as the parasympathetic nervous system.
Right.
And it's very, very important because that's what allows us to relax and ease. And ultimately, that is the beginning of allowing ourselves to open a bit, but feeling open in a safe place, a powerful place, not open, oh my God, what's going to attack me? That's your fight, flight, freeze response, right?
Right.
So calming your body is the first step of that. Now, let me come back to
where you can, sorry to interrupt. I'm just taking this to its logical conclusion. And from there, you've calmed the nerves, the anxiety, the threat of being vulnerable, and you can get to the point where you're like, I'm human, they're human, it's all okay. I can disclose this.
You can, because there's so many different parts of this we can cover, but our nervous systems are, so for the most part, horrendously dysregulated, largely because we are kept in a constant state of stress, of urgency, of consumerism, of not enoughness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. It is a held over from the fact that our primitive mind, which we don't like to talk about, our primitive mind that used to get chased around by saber-toothed tigers, well, that developed over tens of thousands of years, and our higher, executive function and cortex and everything else developed in the recent period of time, over maybe the last, 1,000, 2,000 years or so it is. And so we will tend to revert to the more fight, flight, freeze response of who we are. And anymore, because we are also then pinged by advertising and social media and anything that can stir us up and trigger off some dopamine and things like that. It keeps us ratcheted up. And so it's very easy for us to perceive anything we're going through in our environment as a threat, because we're always on alert. And so if you're always on alert, things are going to look like a threat. So if we can calm that response, if we can begin to settle back into that calmer state, and for any man, or any even former athlete, that if you can get into that place of calm, it's like the whole game slows down. Mm-hmm. Just as good, maybe better. You're just as powerful of a presence. You see more of what's actually unfolding without even needing to move around or do anything about it. And you perform at a much higher level. Well, why isn't that true for our lives as well? This is a way of beginning to bring that back in. And for us, when we are to perform at our best, also means we have to address the things that we have not been willing to face in the past. But we need to do that from that more regulated space, so we feel like we can see more of the field and things are not a threat to us at that point.
Mm-hmm. Love it. So channel our inner Tom Brady in terms of composure. I have all the time in the world to get this ball down the field.
Right? I agree with that, but being from New York, I would use an Aaron Rodgers New York Jets fan reference right now, but that's,
Believe me, the only reason the words Tom Brady come out of my mouth is because he moved to Florida and started to play for the Bucs. Right. As also a native New Yorker, I'm a Giants fan.
There you go.
I'm more like anything not Boston fan, which is why I was so thrilled that Miami beat the Celtics last night, aside from the fact that they're my home team living in South Florida now. So the other thing you mentioned, so you said somatics.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to leverage. Yeah. So for men, and I'll share it in kind of the way that I have with clients and with friends and colleagues, even over dinner. It's to recognize emotions are a point of leverage for us. So for men, very often emotions are viewed from conditioning as a point of weakness, right? And what we don't recognize is that a lot of the emotion that we feel can actually be used as leverage for some form of change within our life. Now, leverage could just simply be facing what we need to face, because that gives us the space to have more energy that'll fuel something else. So very, very basic. Or it could be recognizing when things like frustration or aggravation or anger come up. Those are not meant to be taken out on somebody, but instead it's letting you know that there's maybe a conflict of values or a conflict of priority, or maybe a boundary has been crossed. Trust has been breached. And again, you don't need to lash out or anything like that, but it can give you the leverage to say, something needs to change. I need to make a different decision. I need to approach this differently. And so we can use those emotions as leverage. Now, that said, to begin this journey, just to start down this path, as well as access just that little tiny bit of vulnerability, the way that I have framed this for years, and I'll be honest, provides the greatest leverage for fathers. Although this certainly can be true for uncles, it can be true for any man that has a younger generation that they care very, very much about. But when sitting down, and I'm going to use the example of a father just to make this clear and make the point.
Sure.
Very often they will sit down with me because they are at a point of life where they recognize they checked a lot of the boxes. They thought they'd be happier by now, but instead they're stressed. They're, why doesn't it feel different? What's missing from my life? I'm feeling burnt out. Any number of things, right? You're chuckling from a recognition there, I can tell.
Yeah, the when-then syndrome.
The when-then scenario, right, is a beautiful one, right? And so they're sitting there and they're beginning to have an inkling, that quiet little whisper that says something could be different. They're terrified to listen to that voice because it probably requires some type of change that they don't want to face. And that change they don't even need to know what the change is. It could just be literally an invitation to start looking at things differently and going in a different direction. And so very often what I will ask them to picture is sometimes it's 10 years out, sometimes it's 20 years out. And I want them to picture sitting down for dinner as their children have now entered into their mid-20s. And those children are now going to create the careers and the lives based off of what they have seen their father do over these last 10 or 20 years. And so the choice you make now about this feeling, about this whisper, or about this change that you are really, really worried about, the way that you respond to this is going to be one of the greatest lessons to your children when you're sitting down at that dinner. And so you now have to explain to them as you're sitting at dinner, you need to explain to them, why did you make the choices you made? How do you want that conversation to go? So it provides a point of emotional leverage, because most men are very clear that they want better for their children. In many instances, most men today will tell you, I will sacrifice anything for my children. If it means that I've got to go to a job for 35 years that I hate, that I loathe, but it pays the bills and it pays my healthcare bills and everything else, right? I'm willing to do that. Great. Are you willing for them to live the same life? Because they will. And that's where you begin the emotional leverage. And it's one of those is one of, that's one of those questions or scenarios that it's kind of difficult to take put the blinders back on once you've answered a question like that.
Right. You can't unsee what comes forth from that. In coaching, one of our key skills is asking powerful questions, and questions don't get much more powerful than the ones you just posed. Are you willing for your kids to live the same life you have? And how would you explain why you made the choices you made? Great stuff. Thank you for sharing that. I know folks are going to get so much value out of asking themselves those questions. And I think a good maybe last place to go, because you alluded to it earlier when we were talking about the imprisonment of conditioning.
Yeah.
And you said the words, lay down your image. And I think what the questions you just posed cause men and any human who answers the question to think is, wow, I'm not just my professional identity.
Yes.
And as an example, I'm going to read from your website, your podcast website, onthiswalk.com. You write about yourself, and then, I'll ask you a follow-up question.
Sure.
I'm a dad, a spouse, a partner in business and life, a friend, parenthetical, to some lifelong and to some I just met, a meditator, podcaster, coach, teacher, retreat and journey facilitator, entrepreneur, former CEO, hiker, cycler, runner, sometimes reluctantly, nature lover always, wanderer, and someone fascinated with a Rilke quote, which I love, but I'm not going to read in the interest of time.
Yeah. To live the questions.
Yeah. So first of all, bravo. Like, I love that. I actually do that activity with some of my clients when they're stuck in in their self-worth being defined by what they do for a living. And so I'll say, like, take that mask off. What else are you?
Yeah.
So talk about what it means for you and how you work with clients to discover those things for themselves and put things like former CEO is number like 9 on the list.
It's a process of really getting to know ourselves and what matters most. If there was anything that we can extract out of what we just went through as a world over the last 3 years, is that for a lot of us, it did at least give us a chance to revisit what is it that really truly matters. Because for the most part, we couldn't continue to distract ourselves. We couldn't continue to run away from whatever it was that's been trying to surface in our lives, because we ended up with more time. We ended up with more time to do that looking. And so when we start to get clear on what really truly matters most, part of that is to then take a look at what are all of the different roles that you play, and are those roles presently aligned and prioritized based on what matters most in your life. So for me, part of this change, even, I hit a stage, even being the CEO of a coach training institute, right, of iPEC, and doing this work and training this work. And I myself hit a stage where I was getting burnt out. And I needed to start asking myself a lot of these types of questions and going within as to how really deeply aligned am I to what matters most in my life. And what's important about this, one of the things that's important about this, is that this changes. So I had created a career trajectory and a path in my life, but it was based on decisions that I had made 13, 14, 15 years prior. And now I found myself, at that point, I'd already been CEO for a number of years of iPEC, and I looked around and I went, uh-oh, I'm not that person anymore. No wonder it doesn't quite feel the same. No wonder it feels like more friction is going on in my life. And so I needed to go through that process. And yeah, I'll be honest, I did some of the work, and it was clear the path that I wanted to start to make some changes on. And it was about a year and a half, 2 years later, that we announced to the corporation that my partner and another CEO was taking over, Joan, who's still the CEO there now. And I couldn't have been happier, right? Wow, this is going to free me up to do other things. And Joan is like so ready to do this, and all these things, wonderful things. I make that change. The next morning I wake up, I'm no longer CEO, and the only thought that runs through my head is, what in the hell did you just do? Panic, right? You just spent your entire adult life trying to do what you just got to, and you just handed it away. What are you doing? And that's where I had to go through this work in an even deeper fashion, because I knew I was on the right path. For me at that time, I knew it was the decisions that I needed to make, but I had to keep going deeper to understand really kind of what was at the core and the truth of the type of adjustment that I was trying to make for myself. And that's when I at some point, somewhere in the last 5 years, I actually wrote what you just read, which was originally not because it was a bio or anything along those lines, but it was because it was a reminder of, no, this is who I am. First and foremost, I'm a dad and a spouse. That's what's at the core of my life. And, I look forward to, my children are still just teenagers, but I look forward to, God willing, one day being able to add grandfather to that list. And the reason why I bring that up was that for me, what matters most, and even tying in a bit of that masculine vulnerability into this story, is that I feel that we are being called back as men to bring that archetypal grandfather energy back. It's that ability to have wisdom, that ability to hold space, that endearing, charming, charismatic grandfather who, is going to pat you on the back, talk to you nurturing, but is also going to challenge you when you need to be challenged. They're not going to let you off the hook either, but you feel loved when you feel like you're challenged. We can be both. We can embody that energy again. And, that's just a tiny little glimpse of what I see. But when I did that exercise and I started to write all those things, it started to connect me to, I am all of these things. I'm also none of these things. I'm the awareness and the consciousness that gets to experience these things, that gets
Right.
to play those roles.
Right.
But I'm also the thing that you can't really name.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that is a whole nother podcast.
A whole other conversation. That's on this walk. That's the journey over there.
Excellent. Well, that's the very last place I wanted to go, since one of your identities is podcaster, and your podcast On This Walk, very popular. Just tell us a little bit about the podcast and what listeners can expect.
Sure. Thanks for that. It honestly, it is what I just started to allude to, which is that it's my journey. It kind of picks up from when I started to burn out about, I guess now at this point, probably 7+ years ago, and the journey that I've gone on. From that time, I went into things like, I went into mindfulness and Buddhism, which took me into a whole study of different Eastern wisdom traditions. That ultimately led me back around, and I studied things like Gnosticism and Christ consciousness. I've studied indigenous wisdoms. I've combined all of that with, because of our background, my background in coaching, I combine that with the background I have in positive psychology and a layman's study of neuroscience and all sorts of other practices. And the journey, if I summarize just only one piece of this, was for me to recognize that modern science is finally proving what they already knew 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. And so the On This Walk is really that exploration. It's the questions I've walked with. It's some of the teachers that I've walked with, some of the colleagues and friends that I've walked with during this time, and continue to, because I keep getting through the work, I keep getting introduced to other people that either have just these really deep, compelling stories that I feel are a similar walk or something, related to what I've experienced. And in other instances, people that I've literally just met because of a team friend, a colleague,
Right.
and having experience with them and saying, this is yet another leg of my journey. And I need to share that, because to me, it's the untold side of what, Shani, you and I do. We get to see, and a lot of, even within our industry, you see a lot of the successes, you see the inspiration stories, you see all this beautiful stuff. You don't always get to see the behind the scenes. To me, this is a bit more of the behind the scenes walk.
I love that. So you're modeling vulnerability in a very public way, which I think is fantastic.
Thank you.
And I love that it's a walk, it's a journey, and it's a lifelong journey, maybe a multi-lifelong journey.
Exactly.
Again, podcast episode. One of my favorite quotes from Abraham Hicks is, "You'll never get it right, you'll never get it done." We're always learning, we're always growing. Just when we think we've conquered one thing, there's something else that comes up, or it's the same thing in a different form. We're like, oh, damn, I thought I had that one. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the fun of it. I've actually enjoyed that crazy spiral roller coaster that we seem to be on. But when you all of a sudden end up in a similar situation, but it seems brand new because you're brand new in that moment, that to me is a fun part of the journey. It's a fun part of the experience.
Well, this was fun. Speaking of fun, how can folks reach you, Luke?
Thanks, Shani. OnThisWalk.com, by far best place to find me. Check out On This Walk, the podcast. Also, if you want to know what's going on with me, that's quite literally the best place to find it. And then if you look up my name, Luke Iorio, you'll find me on any of the socials.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you being on the show today and your generous sharing of some of the things you work with your clients and men's circles on. Immensely helpful. And leader shifters, just to underline a couple of things. And one of them is going to be a reiteration, which is vulnerability is a form of strength, and don't confuse it with how you are socialized. We've got to break free of those ideas. Realize that you have so many different identities, and the sooner you realize that, the more you can show up in a way that you'll be proud of for your kids. And that leads me to those questions that you pose for ways that you can really jumpstart your journey, folks. And again, not just for men, for anyone who is feeling stuck or caged. Like, how are you going to explain to your kids why you've made the decisions that you have? And do you want your kids to walk that same path that you did, or do you want something different for them? And if you want the latter, you've got to be the change you want to see in future generations. So we've come to the end of the show. Again, Luke, thank you so much for joining us, and Leader Shifters, thank you as always for listening and watching. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Go to theleadershipproject.com to sign up for the Scoop newsletter and explore all the resources from this podcast in the show notes. And follow me on Instagram at The Leadership Project and LinkedIn under my name, Shani Magoski, for inspiration and content about all things leadership. Make it a great day.